All right, welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive.
Yeah.
Today, we're going to be looking at something
Okay.
that's sadly still very relevant,
Mm-hmm.
and that is white supremacy.
All right.
So we're going to be taking excerpts from the myth of white supremacy,
Okay.
and we're going to be trying to unpack not just what this phrase means, but also like its historical roots, the psychology behind it,
Right.
and why it's just so important to understand even in today's world, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
You don't want just like the surface level explanations, right?
Yeah.
We want to examine like the systems at play
Yeah.
and how this ideology has just managed to persist for so long, you know?
Well, and I think what's so interesting is, like, right from the start, the source calls it out as a myth.
Okay.
Like, it challenges us to question something that's, like, often presented as just a given, you know?
So let's break down then why it's considered a myth. If
Yeah.
we're looking like beyond the surface, it seems like there's like a historical narrative.
Right?
And I think that narrative maybe starts with the age of exploration, right?
Yeah.
Was it during this period that like the seeds of this ideology were like sown?
It's definitely a crucial starting point.
Okay.
As, you know, Europeans ventured out, encountered diverse cultures.
Yeah.
That's really when we start to see this sense of, like, ethnocentrism
Mm-hmm.
emerge.
Okay.
You know, like, their own worldview became the correct one,
Mm-hmm.
the standard by which all others were judged.
It sounds like a very slippery slope.
Yeah.
You know, like one minute you're exploring, the next you're like
Yeah.
imposing your own values as superior.
Right.
Did this ethnocentric perspective like lay the groundwork for what we now recognize as white supremacy?
Precisely.
Okay.
And to further solidify their position, they began to rely on what they called scientific racism,
Oh.
which is, you know,
Okay.
it's astounding to look
Yeah.
back and see how they tried to use science
Yeah.
to justify something as abhorrent as slavery.
Yeah, I'm curious about this, like this so-called science.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate a little bit on how they twisted like scientific ideas to fit their narrative?
Yeah, so during the 18th and 19th centuries, you saw these, like, pseudo-scientific theories emerge,
Mm-hmm.
attempting to, like, categorize and rank human races.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, these theories lacked any real scientific basis,
Right.
but they were
Okay.
they were cleverly used to put white Europeans at the top
Mm-hmm.
of this, like, completely fabricated hierarchy.
Okay.
And so this manipulation of, like, scientific concepts,
Mm-hmm.
it provided this, like, veneer of legitimacy
Right.
to the horrors of colonialism and the barbaric practice of slavery.
It's almost as if they like selectively used science to reinforce their like pre-existing biases, right?
Yeah.
It makes you question like, you know, the motivations behind these explorations, right?
Right.
Was it truly about like discovery, or
Yeah.
was there like a more insidious agenda at play from the beginning?
It's a question worth pondering, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, the age of exploration, it did bring about incredible advancements,
Yeah.
but it's undeniable that it was intertwined with, like, economic and political ambitions, right?
Okay.
This desire for, like, resources, power, and control, all of that played a significant role
Okay.
in shaping the narrative.
So the source also points to the role of religion in kind of furthering this agenda. Could you shed some light on how like religious beliefs were manipulated to support like this idea of white superiority?
Well, some Europeans, they felt like they were driven by this, like, sense of religious righteousness.
Okay.
You know, they believed it was their duty to civilize non-white populations.
Mm-hmm.
So they used this phrase, white man's burden,
Okay.
to justify their actions, right?
Yeah.
They were disguising imperialism
Right.
as this moral obligation.
It's amazing how they twisted something as like personal as faith, right?
Yeah.
To serve their like imperialistic ambitions. It seems like every facet of society, right?
Yeah.
From science to religion was used to kind of like solidify their position.
Right.
But even with all these justifications, the source points out a simple yet profound truth, right?
Yeah.
And that is that skin color is merely a reflection of melanin levels, right? Influenced by our ancestors' proximity to the equator.
That's a crucial point, right?
Yeah.
Like, reducing someone's worth to the amount of melanin in their skin.
Yeah.
It's not only scientifically unsound, but it's deeply dehumanizing.
Okay.
It's a testament to how ingrained these biases were,
Yeah.
that such a superficial trait became the cornerstone of an entire hierarchy of human value.
It's just a stark reminder then that like the concept of race as we understand it is a social construct, not a biological fact.
Right.
So did this realization come about through like scientific advancements, or were there other forces at play?
I mean, advancements in genetics definitely played a significant role in debunking this myth of racial superiority. Genetic studies have revealed more variation within racial groups than between them.
Okay.
So it highlights the absurdity of these like constructed categories.
Yeah.
They're really just tools for maintaining power and control,
Okay.
not reflections of any biological reality.
So someone with ancestors from like Norway and someone with ancestors from like Kenya, despite being categorized as different races, could be more genetically similar than two individuals from the same region.
Exactly.
That just like completely dismantles this whole like notion of like separate and inherently unequal races.
It does. It reinforces this idea that these categories are like arbitrary and meaningless.
Right.
They were constructed to serve a specific purpose.
Okay.
And that purpose was to justify existing power structures and rationalize the mistreatment of entire populations.
Okay, so if we shift our focus from this like twisted science, right,
to
the like real world impact, the source dives into the transatlantic slave trade, a system built on this false premise of African inferiority. It's a harrowing chapter of history that continues to like cast a long shadow on our present.
It really does. It stands as this horrific testament to the devastating consequences of white supremacy. It's a stark reminder that these beliefs weren't just abstract ideas. They translated into these brutal systems of oppression that inflicted just unimaginable suffering. And the scars of this system, they're deeply ingrained in the social and economic fabric of our society. We're still grappling with its legacy.
It seems like the slave trade was almost like a turning point where it really like cemented the idea of white supremacy into like the very fabric of like Western society. So was this where the ideology like truly took root and began to like shape global power dynamics?
The slave trade undoubtedly played a pivotal role in like entrenching white supremacy. But its roots can be traced back even further to the era of colonialism. Where European powers, asserted their dominance over vast territories, exploited resources, creating this system of global inequality that persists even to this day.
So colonialism created a system where like white Europeans held all the cards, right? Political, economic, and social power. It's like a vicious cycle with one system of oppression just fueling the next. And this brings us to the age of imperialism, which seemed to like solidify this belief in white superiority on a global scale. So was this when the ideology like reached its peak? Shaping the world in its image?
Imperialism definitely marked like a significant expansion of like white supremacist ideology, impacting global power structures and just reinforcing these existing inequalities. It was during this period that we saw the rise of social Darwinism. Which is this like distorted interpretation of Darwin's theory of evolution that they use to justify social hierarchies and, further solidify this notion of white superiority.
It's just incredible how they manipulated like scientific concepts to fit their agenda. Makes you wonder, like, were they genuinely convinced by these like twisted interpretations, or was it just like a deliberate attempt to like mask their pursuit of power and control under like this guise of intellectualism?
It's hard to say for sure. Maybe a combination of both, right? Like a genuine belief in their own superiority, coupled with this calculated effort to like rationalize their actions. But regardless of their motivations, the consequences were undeniable, right? These ideas, they permeated society. They shaped public perception. They reinforced existing power structures.
The source also highlights the role of like media and propaganda in perpetuating these like harmful stereotypes. It makes you realize how like the information we consume really shapes our understanding of the world. And can be used to manipulate our perceptions of like entire groups of people.
Throughout history, media and propaganda have been so powerful in constructing and spreading these narratives that reinforce white supremacy by portraying people of color in these like negative, stereotypical ways,
Right.
while simultaneously glorifying white Europeans. They created this like distorted reality that served to maintain the status quo.
It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? You create a narrative, you spread it through media, and suddenly it becomes like
truth.
Accepted as truth.
Yeah.
And let's not forget about the role of education.
Right.
The source mentions how Eurocentric education systems contributed to this like biased view of history and culture. So did this like limited perspective further solidify the myth of white supremacy?
Absolutely. I mean, when the history books are written from a single biased perspective, it's easy to see how generations just internalized this idea of white superiority. It became the default narrative, the unquestioned truth that shaped their understanding of the world.
It's as if these narratives were like woven into the very fabric of society, becoming so ingrained that they were almost like invisible.
Right.
This brings us to the psychology behind white supremacy. The source delves into in-group bias and its role in like reinforcing feelings of superiority. So could you explain this concept a little further?
Sure. So in-group bias is this well-documented psychological phenomenon where individuals favor their own group and perceive their own ways of doing things as superior. And so in societies where, you know, white people hold the majority of power and privilege, this bias can manifest as this sense of like entitlement, this belief that they're inherently better than those outside their group.
But wouldn't that imply that like everyone's susceptible to in-group bias, regardless of like their race or social standing? So how can we be sure that it's not just like a human tendency rather than something specifically linked to like white supremacy?
You're right. In-group bias is a human tendency. But in the context of white supremacy, it becomes particularly problematic. Because it operates within this system that already grants significant advantages to one group. So this pre-existing power dynamic, it amplifies the effects of in-group bias. Creating this like cycle of privilege and oppression.
So it's not just about like recognizing our own biases, but also understanding how those biases operate within a larger system that, you know, reinforces these inequalities.
Exactly.
The source also suggests that like fear and insecurity can fuel this need to like denigrate others. It's kind of a troubling thought.
It is.
But is it possible that putting others down is a way to like make oneself feel better, more secure in their own position?
That's a key insight. When individuals feel threatened or insecure, they often lash out at those they perceive as like different or as a threat to their own status. It's a defense mechanism, you know, a way to bolster their own fragile ego. And sadly, it often manifests as prejudice, discrimination, and even violence.
It seems like fear and insecurity are like powerful motivators.
They are.
Capable of driving people to act in ways they might not otherwise. And this brings us to like a particularly disturbing aspect of white supremacy, and that is like the language of hate. The source highlights specific examples of dehumanizing language, such as like calling Black people monkeys, Jews filthy animals, and Chinese yellow chickens.
These slurs, they're more than just words. They're weapons, you know, designed to strip individuals of their humanity. And to justify these unspeakable acts of cruelty and violence.
It's chilling.
They carry the weight of history. The legacy of slavery, colonialism, the Holocaust. And by understanding that historical context, we can begin to grasp the true gravity of these words, the pain they inflict, the damage they perpetuate.
It's chilling how these terms reduce individuals to like the level of animals, It seems like this dehumanization serves as this like psychological tool to like disengage empathy and justify these oppressive actions. So was this like a deliberate strategy employed throughout history?
Absolutely.
Or did this language of hate like evolve more organically?
The use of dehumanizing language, it's a deliberate tactic. It's a calculated strategy to make it easier to mistreat and exploit others. You know, by denying individuals their humanity. By reducing them to animals or objects. It becomes easier to justify discrimination, violence, even genocide.
And it's not just like the animalistic comparisons that are harmful, right?
Right.
This source also points out how slurs erase individuality,
right?
Lumping entire groups together
Yeah.
under these sweeping negative stereotypes.
Right, exactly.
It's as if they're trying to like deny the very existence of like individual stories, experiences, and complexities.
But that's a crucial point.
Yeah.
These slurs, they serve to erase the humanity of the individual,
Right.
reducing them to a caricature, a stereotype.
Yeah.
It becomes easier to dismiss their perspectives, their feelings,
Right.
their very existence
Right.
as equal members of society.
Right.
You know, they're denying individuals the right to be seen
Yeah.
and understood as unique human beings.
The source then goes on to provide specific historical examples of how these slurs have been weaponized, referencing like slavery, colonialism, anti-Semitism, and the Yellow Peril.
Right.
It's a stark reminder of the long and brutal history
It is.
of, racism and discrimination that these words are connected to.
It's not just ancient history. I mean, these same tactics are still being used today to marginalize and dehumanize groups.
Yep.
Think about the rhetoric used against immigrants, refugees, religious minorities. It often echoes these same themes of like dehumanization and fear-mongering that we see in these historical examples.
It's a sobering reminder that the fight for equality is far from over.
Yeah.
We can't afford to become complacent.
Right.
Now, the source dedicates a whole section to understanding the Jewish case.
Okay.
So exploring the specific factors that have fueled anti-Semitism throughout history.
Right.
Why is it important to examine the Jewish experience separately? Like, what makes their story unique?
Anti-Semitism has this long and tragic history.
Yeah.
Distinct in its nature and evolution.
Okay.
While other forms of racism often focus on like physical characteristics, anti-Semitism targets a religious and cultural identity.
Right.
And so this distinction has led to this like unique set of stereotypes and prejudices that have persisted for centuries.
So it's about understanding the nuances, the specific historical and social context that has shaped like the Jewish experience.
Exactly.
The source highlights how like religious and cultural differences have often been used to other Jewish people, making them targets of like suspicion and discrimination. So could you elaborate on how these like differences were used to justify prejudice against them?
Throughout history, Jewish religious practices and cultural traditions have been portrayed as like strange, foreign, even threatening.
Okay.
This othering served to create this sense of distance and distrust between Jewish communities and the dominant Christian society.
Okay.
And so it made it easier to justify discrimination and persecution.
And then there are the economic stereotypes.
Yeah.
Right. Those like age-old tropes about Jews being like greedy or controlling finances. It seems like these stereotypes were often used as like a convenient scapegoat for broader economic anxieties or inequalities.
Absolutely. And these stereotypes have been incredibly persistent throughout history.
Yeah.
They've been used to justify everything from social exclusion to outright violence.
Right.
By blaming Jews for economic hardship, those in power could deflect blame and maintain their own positions.
The source also mentions the role of like conspiracy theories in fueling anti-Semitism. It's a reminder of how dangerous misinformation can be, especially when it taps into like existing prejudices and fears.
Conspiracy theories have played a significant role in perpetuating anti-Semitism, often portraying Jews as these like powerful, shadowy figures controlling governments or financial systems. And so these narratives, they prey on existing fears and anxieties, creating a scapegoat for complex societal problems.
Yeah.
And the danger of these theories is that they can spread so rapidly, particularly in today's digital age, where misinformation can quickly go viral.
It's a stark reminder that we need to be like critical consumers of information.
Absolutely.
Especially online.
Yeah.
We can't just blindly accept everything we read or hear.
Exactly.
Now, we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
From like the historical roots of white supremacy to the psychological factors that contribute to it, to the very language used to perpetuate this harmful ideology.
Yes.
So what does this all mean? Where do we go from here?
The source emphasizes like a few key takeaways that are worth reiterating.
Okay.
First, The concept of race is a social construct,
Okay.
not a biological reality.
Right.
There's no scientific basis for claims of racial superiority.
Right.
It's an idea that was created to serve a purpose, and that purpose was to justify power and control.
Okay. Second.
Second, racism is not just an individual belief.
Right.
It's a system of oppression that's embedded in our institutions, our laws, our culture.
Right.
It's something we need to actively dismantle,
Okay.
not just passively condemn.
And finally.
And finally, and perhaps most importantly,
Okay.
we all have a responsibility to challenge racist beliefs and behaviors, no matter how small they may seem.
Right.
Silence is complicity.
Yeah.
We need to be actively engaged in this fight
Right.
for a more just and equitable world for everyone.
Those are great insights.
Yeah.
I really appreciate that. It's a powerful call to action.
It is.
But before we go,
Yeah.
I'm curious to hear your final thoughts on this whole idea of like the myth of white supremacy.
Okay.
What's like the most important thing for our listeners to take away from this deep dive?
I think understanding the roots of white supremacy, historical and psychological, it's essential.
Right.
But it's just the first step.
Okay.
The real work is in actively challenging these beliefs and dismantling the systems that perpetuate them.
Okay.
It's about recognizing our own biases,
Yeah.
calling out racism when we see it,
Right.
and working toward, a more inclusive
Yeah.
and equitable world for everyone.
That makes a lot of sense. We can't just like hope for change.
Right.
Right. We have to be like active participants
Yeah.
in creating that change.
Absolutely.
So what can our listeners do?
Right.
Where do they even begin to tackle something this like big and complex?
It's a daunting question.
Yeah.
And there's no easy answer.
Right.
But I believe it starts with education.
Okay.
We need to educate ourselves
Yeah.
and others about the history of racism,
Yeah.
how it manifests in our society,
Right.
the impact it has on individuals and communities. And there are tons of resources available,
Yeah.
books, articles, documentaries, all sorts of things
Right.
that can deepen our understanding.
And what about like those uncomfortable conversations?
Yeah.
We sometimes try to shy away from. It seems like having those difficult dialogues with friends, family, colleagues is crucial to challenging these like ingrained beliefs and biases.
That's not always easy.
Right.
But creating these spaces where people feel safe to ask questions, challenge their assumptions, learn from each other.
Yeah.
That is so essential.
Right.
Open and honest dialogue can be such a powerful tool for growth and understanding.
Are there other ways we can contribute to this change? What about like supporting organizations that are like fighting racism and promoting equality?
That's a concrete step everyone can take.
Okay.
There are so many groups doing incredible work,
Right.
Advocating for policy changes, providing resources to communities of color,
Yeah.
pushing for systemic change.
Right.
Donate your time,
Yeah.
your money, your skills to these organizations that are aligned with your values.
Right.
Amplify their voices on social media,
Yeah.
share their work.
Yeah.
Every action, no matter how small,
Right.
contributes to this collective effort.
So it's about like showing up, speaking out, refusing to be silent in the face of injustice.
Exactly.
We can all be part of the solution.
We can.
This deep dive has been like incredibly insightful.
It has.
Prompting us to like confront these uncomfortable truths and examine our own roles in like perpetuating or dismantling these harmful systems.
Right.
It's a lot to process.
It is.
But having these conversations is crucial. We need to shine a light on these issues and commit to creating a world where the myth of white supremacy is finally laid to rest.
Yeah. And remember, dismantling systems of oppression benefits everyone.
Right.
Not just those who've been historically marginalized.
Yeah.
It creates this more just, equitable, ultimately a more humane society for all of us.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I leave you with this final thought about what will your role be in building that more just and equitable world?
Good question.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
This is DigitView.